flowers, cards, and candy. The hater was listening to some Usher in the car, and that part was about to come up before I hit record, which means one thing and one thing only. Hater on the road. More specifically, hater stuck in about an hour of traffic. Some idiot got into an accident. I hope they're okay, but this has caused traffic throughout the highway. So the hater thought, what better time than now to make some videos? But I'm stuck in gridlock traffic, which means I was able to take notes and make a good video for all of you. Well, I'm making the video now, but I made the list for all of y'all while I'm stuck not moving around. Now, today's video is going to be about the top 10 greatest gimmick changes, okay? A few ground rules. Number one, in order to qualify for this list, the gimmick change must be a serious change. Meaning that, for example, John Cena going from random nobody to like Thugonomics, that's not a significant change in the sense that the first gimmick wasn't a gimmick, right? You could argue that John Cena as Thugonomics is his introduction to wrestling, right? Things like that are not going to count. In addition, gimmick changes where someone goes from a goofy gimmick, right, or any gimmick for that matter, to who they really are in real life, they're not going to count either. So for example, like The Rock being like the blue chip athlete and becoming the great one, that's not going to count. The Rock becoming the final boss, that's not going to count. Stone Cold, that's not going to count. The only way that's going to count is if the first gimmick was an iconic gimmick, that kind of thing, right? So for example, let's say Kane went from being Kane to being just like Glenn Jacobs, right? Then that would count because Kane is like an iconic gimmick. But the people that made their names with one main gimmick, the gimmick before that doesn't necessarily count unless it was a fully fleshed out gimmick. Thirdly, people that went from a goofy character to themselves, and this was the logical progression of the gimmick, that's definitely not going to count. So I'm talking about people like the Hurricane becoming, going from Hurricane to Gregory Helms, right? Which I thought was a great transition, but not a great gimmick shift because he basically just abandoned the gimmick. You see what I'm saying? He didn't get a new gimmick. He just became Gregory Helms, right? Another example of that would be Mark Henry. Mark Henry went from the sexual chocolate. Eventually, he left for a bit. He came back as the world's strongest man, Mark Henry. Now, he was the world's strongest man, Mark Henry. So this gimmick is immaterial. It's not a big shift, right? Now, with that being said, also, one other disclaimer. We're not going to count gimmick shifts where like someone in a tag team becomes like an extension of the character they played in the tag team. So for example, someone like Bubba Ray Dudley, who was always like an asshole bully, becoming Bully Ray, even though I think that's amazing, right? It's just an extension of Bubba Ray Dudley. It's nothing new, right? Or like Edge and Christian, for example, right? Christian and Edge were both asshole heels, and they were asshole heels as a tag team. Like goofball asshole heels, and that's what they remain. So that doesn't count, even though both of them have had Hall of Fame careers. Now, without further ado, let's start this list off with an unexpected surprise. I'm sure most of you are expecting The Undertaker to be at number 1. Will he be? Let's see. Now, the first person on the list coming in at number 10 is none other than the Cuckster himself, Cody Rhodes. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Hater, Cody Rhodes sucks, and I agree. But Cody Rhodes has not always sucked. The gimmick shift that I'm talking about here is Cody Rhodes starting out effectively with like the I'm good looking gimmick, right? The dashing Cody Rhodes gimmick. Everything before that, he was just generic Cody Rhodes. Kind of like what he is right now. Generic Cody Rhodes with blonde hair. Back then he had dark hair. That's the only difference. But dashing Cody Rhodes was a mediocre gimmick. I didn't think it was a bad gimmick like everyone else did. I thought it was mediocre. It's a placeholder gimmick. But when he feuded with Rey Mysterio, and Rey Mysterio 619'd him in the face with his knee brace, Cody Rhodes had a mental breakdown. This was awesome, right? This was awesome. Now, with that being said, it should be noted that this gimmick was awesome for 2 reasons. Number 1, and I have to give props where props are due, Cody's performance of the gimmick was excellent, right? Nobody expected that from Cody Rhodes, and he did great. Now, another thing that made it great was the storyline logic and the relation to the previous gimmick, which is a theme that we're going to see again and again in this list, right? The undashing gimmick doesn't work if randomly Rey Mysterio hits Cody Rhodes in the face with the 619. It only works if Cody Rhodes first starts out with a dashing gimmick, right? And this is what makes it a great gimmick shift, right? A great gimmick shift. Now, Coming in at number 9, we have, that's right, the New Day. This current incarnation of the New Day. Now, this gimmick is not a big change yet because we don't know what's going to happen, but the heel turn is one of the greatest heel turns, in my opinion, of all time. Only because of the longevity of the New Day as faces. They were faces for like 7 years, you know what I mean? So them turning heel, and especially the way they did it, is unexpected. Once again, the interplay between the original New Day gimmick of these happy-go-lucky guys whose entire gimmick is their 3 best friends, to 2 of them being asshole best friends, the juxtaposition between the 2 is what makes this great, and it's what made the moment great. You understand? Next, number 8, a personal favorite of mine. I know a lot of people aren't going to agree. The Reverend Devon. That's right. I'm a big Reverend Devon fan. I thought the Reverend Devon gimmick was amazing. Now, this is especially interesting because Devon was a tag team guy, right? I was almost said tag team jobber, but he wasn't a jobber. As a matter of fact, the Dudley Boys, in my opinion, are the closest tag team to ever get to the main event. Don't give me that shit about Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens and the Usos. No. Like, the Dudley Boys were presented as a legitimate threat as a tag team. Like, they would periodically beat, like, the Big Show in a 2-on-1 match. They would beat, like, Kane and Undertaker. You know what I mean? They had success as a tag team because they were a tag team. Now, when they split, Bubba Ray just stayed as Bubba Ray, right? He was just another Dudley. Devon took a new character altogether. This character was that of a charlatanistic preacher, right? A charlatanistic reverend who's not there to help anybody, but it's just there for donations. You know what I'm saying? So, I thought this was a great gimmick, and I thought it was a complete deviation from the Devon gimmick, specifically because Devon didn't really do anything as a member of the Dudley Boys. Their gimmick was just these 2, like, tough guys who put people through tables and wear glasses and are half brothers, right? So this gimmick is a complete paradigm shift in the sense that now it's a completely new Devon with an entire new, like, storyline and opportunities and possibilities. Number 7. This is going to be a little bit of a cop-out, but the answer for number 7 is straight up Eddie Guerrero. Now, I can't pinpoint one gimmick shift of Eddie Guerrero's, but in totality, all of the Eddie Guerrero gimmicks and the shifts between them were amazing, right? Now, some of you are thinking, well, he didn't have that many gimmicks. That's maybe true, right? And some of the gimmicks are actually more like character developments, but they are consistent in their inconsistency with Eddie Guerrero playing all of them perfectly. And as a result, he deserves a spot on this list as far as I'm concerned. Now, let's go through the Eddie Guerrero gimmicks real fast. First of all, he starts out irrelevant in WWE as just a member of the Radicals. They're just 4 guys from WCW, hardly a gimmick, right? Then he quickly, while in that group, develops his first gimmick, Mamacita, right? The Latino playboy, right? Which eventually develops slowly as the same gimmick as the Latino, like, lover / great boyfriend to China. Always getting her flowers, you know, that Latino romance, lighting candles, that kind of stuff. This was great. Then he switches to another Latino stereotype, the abusive Latino boyfriend, right? This was great. And once again, it only works because he was introduced as a caring and loving Latino boyfriend, and then he switches to a Latino, like, abusive boyfriend. You understand? That's why it works. Then we have another shift completely out of the blue. Eddie Guerrero just becomes lie, cheat, and steal Eddie Guerrero, which is a delineated gimmick. And within this gimmick, Eddie Guerrero somehow manages to be a face. They started as heels, but eventually, of course, he gets over because he's Eddie Guerrero. So he gets over immediately, and he becomes a face. Then another slight gimmick shift into the I'm your papi gimmick, right? Which is an extension of the same bastard that would cheat and steal and do devious things, but now it's a heel version. And the beauty of it is that when Eddie Guerrero was a face, everyone loved him. Nobody could ever be angry that Eddie Guerrero, like, cheated against, I don't know, like Mr. Anderson or something and beat him in a match by cheating. Nobody cared because Eddie Guerrero was so cool. But when Eddie Guerrero turned on Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero played like the most sadistic bastard of a heel until, like, Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods. You know what I mean? Like, this was just like a bastardish, like, heel. So I really like this. I really enjoyed all of Eddie Guerrero's work, so I think he merits a spot on this list. However, the hater is aware that this might not fit the criteria that I earlier set out. So I have an alternate for number 7. I couldn't decide who was going to be number 7. So, you know, number 7 is held up by 2 people. Not to diminish, you know, the position of number 7. Both of these gimmicks, in my opinion, are better than the ones that I've already mentioned. At number 7, the alternate is Booker T, King Booker. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a second, hater, this is hardly a gimmick. He just wore a cape and a hat. No, that's not all he did. First of all, King Booker was awesome. He is the best King of the Ring of all time. And more importantly, he is the best guy to ever play the King of the Ring role, right? Because those are two different things, right? He made the most out of his King of the Ring, in my opinion, and he was the greatest King of the Ring ever. Now, with all that being said, let's compartmentalize that and move on a little bit to TNA Booker T, right? Where he reestablished the King gimmick as an African king. It's like Booker T was already a legend before the invasion era, right? Then, in my opinion, Booker T had like 1.5 more Hall of Fame careers. You understand? In my opinion, King Booker merits a spot in the Hall of Fame separate from Booker T. But that's just me. The other part of Booker T being Booker T on Monday Night Raw and SmackDown was also excellent. That merits like a half inclusion. Booker T is clearly a Hall of Famer. Obviously, we already know that. But the King Booker gimmick was amazing. First of all, it was hilarious. Second of all, it comes from a man called Booker T who was already a legend. Right? This is another thing that we're going to see coming up here now and again, right? That people that don't need gimmick shifts do them the best, right? Which proves that they were good all along, and as a result, Booker T is someone that we should have respected the entire time, and most of us did. Now, another thing about the King of the Ring gimmick was all the stuff that he started doing. He started doing new poses, new taunts. He had a new entrance music. He had a new entrance walk. His wife became Queen Charmel. Like, a lot of things changed around the fact that he won the King of the Ring. And the underpinnings of the gimmick were that Booker T really believes himself to be a king, right? He didn't pretend. He really thought he was a king, right? Not in like a retarded way like R-Truth would do, but in like a narcissistic way. His gimmick went from like the street tough guy from Texas to essentially like a fucking narcissist who thinks he's a king and acts like a king. This is a point that a lot of people didn't get because a lot of people are dumbasses. Booker T is obviously an intelligent guy, so he was able to leverage this into great things. Now, with that being said, let's move on to number 6. Joker Sting. Now, the same thing that I just said about Booker T applies to the Joker Sting. Sting was already a multiple-time Hall of Famer, if you ask me, right? By the time that WCW folded, right? He came in later to TNA and had another Hall of Fame run, if you ask me. And more importantly, during this run, despite having the most iconic gimmick maybe ever, right? Sting decided to change it up. He didn't have to, but he decided to. Compare this, let's say, to Trick Williams, who has no gimmick, or Alex Shelley, who has had infinite opportunities over his 30-year career to change gimmicks and hasn't, right? Think about that for a second. Joker Sting was great. Sting played it perfectly, and it was a complete contrast to the otherwise very serious character of Sting. Sting is supposed to be this vengeful spirit, basically. This vengeful entity, right? Like, not a spirit like as a ghost, but the spirit of the gimmick is that he's this vengeful guy who takes things seriously and just beats people up, right? And obviously he's based on the Crow. But the Joker Sting was like the opposite. He was like this goof. He was like the Joker. And also, obviously, it fits really well because he changed the face paint, and that was just enough to make it awesome, in my opinion. Now, reason number 5. Gimmick change number 5. Another slight cop-out. Right to censor. Now, this is a cop-out because it's not one person. It is an amalgamation of people. Specifically, the ones that I think merit the most discussion are Stevie Richards, who was this jobber goof who took nothing seriously, right? Val Venus, whose gimmick was he was a porn star, and Godfather, whose gimmick was that he was a pimp. Forget about Bull Buchanan and Ivory. They were just there to fill seats. These 3 guys, right, completely reinvented their careers with this, right? The Godfather was becoming stale. Val Venus was becoming stale. And Stevie Richards never had a chance. But they got a massive push, in my opinion, as a faction because these 3 guys, arguably 3 of the biggest goofs on the roster, became the 3 most serious people on the roster. This was amazing. Right to Censor is insanely underrated as a faction. And in my opinion, they definitely deserve their spot at number 5. Now we get to the top 4, which is where things start getting interesting. Coming in at number 4 is D'Angelo Dinero. Now, some of you may not know who that is, but back in the WWE version of ECW, there was a wrestler called Sylvester Terkay. Sylvester Terkay was like basically like a Rusev. He was this big, strong motherfucker who had like a mixed martial arts gimmick, right? His manager / corner man was a man called Elijah Burke. Elijah Burke was also an accomplished boxer or whatever. That was part of his gimmick. But he was a corner man, right? And that didn't really do anything. However, Elijah Burke is, you could make an argument that Elijah Burke is like the most underutilized wrestler of all time, right? Like Elijah Burke is just somebody that like, he should have been a world champion. This guy had everything. He's a good looking guy, incredible physique, like 10 out of 10 charisma, insane, right? And he almost did it in TNA where he was introduced as the Pope, D'Angelo Dinero. The Pope was it was basically another Reverend Devon, right? He was this charlatanistic street preacher in this sense, right? He would take money from people. It's basically Reverend Devon, but done with a wrestler who's better looking and younger, more athletic, better physique. And when I say this, don't get me wrong, Devon is like definitely in my top like 20 wrestlers of all time, along with Bubba, you know what I mean? So I'm not fucking around. Devon rules. He was in this list as we speak. But D'Angelo Dinero, this was a main event gimmick that didn't get the main event push. Now, with that being said, we're now at the top 3. But before we do the top 3, let's take a break and do some honorable mentions, cuckolds. Honorable mention 1, Matt Hardy. Woken and broken Matt Hardy. You know, enough said. Honorable mention 2, this is a very underrated gimmick shift. The Antichrist of professional wrestling, Jeff Hardy, right? When Jeff Hardy turned heel, this was insane. Number 3, Hulk Hogan NWO, right? Not the NWO because, you know, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were just those dudes. That would disqualify them. They just turned into themselves. But Hulk Hogan had a significant, like, gimmick shift in that, right? But not quite as good as the other ones, in my opinion, because the NWO is not really like a delineated gimmick. There was another one that I had that was really good. Oh, that's right. Sean O'Hare, right? But this never really materialized. The problem is he had all these great vignettes as like the devil's advocate, as people call it now. But Sean O'Hare was awesome, and Sean O'Hare deserved a run with that gimmick. But then they just saddled him up with like Roddy Piper, and nothing really came of that. And another honorable mention, Toni Storm in AEW, right? Like, she switched from like just a random person to, you know, like a 50s starlet, like Marilyn Monroe type of gimmick, right? The gimmick itself isn't great, but the shift is what we're talking about here. Now, coming in number 3, this will surprise many of you, The Undertaker, playa. Now, The Undertaker is known for having one of the greatest gimmicks of all time, the Dead Man, right? And it's because of the fact that, in my opinion, the American Badass, although a great gimmick in and of itself, is not as good as the Dead Man gimmick. It's at least not as iconic, right? The gimmick shift is still one of the best ever, right? Because The Undertaker went from a completely different character to like an extension of himself, which means he's nearly disqualified from this list for the reasons I stated at the beginning. However, I also stated the caveat. If someone goes from an iconic gimmick to an extension of themselves, that would count. And this is that. Furthermore, the American Badass is not who The Undertaker is in real life, right? The American Badass was like another level, you know what I mean? He was an exaggerated persona. Like, it's like, it was a gimmick, it was a character. Like, The Undertaker is not like that, you know? He's not out there just chewing tobacco and like, you know, saying, I'm gonna beat everybody up. Like, you know, he's a normal dude in real life. But great gimmick shift, one of the best of all time. Now, we only have 2 more. So I'm curious to see if anybody has caught on to what these 2 might be. But coming in at number 2, JBL, all right? There's not much I need to say about this. Everybody knows I'm a big JBL guy. But the shift from Bradshaw to JBL is amazing, right? When I say the shift in this instance, I'm specifically talking about the actual like 2-episode arc where this happened. Because it happened out of nowhere, right? One episode, him and Farouk are in a tag team match. And Paul Heyman says, if you lose, you get fired. Farouk gets pinned. And like they go to Paul Heyman to like threaten him. Paul Heyman says, I didn't say you're both fired. I see a lot of potential in you, Bradshaw. Farouk is fired. And that's when the heel turn began. Bradshaw betrays Farouk, right? Farouk was set to retire. Bradshaw was like he was much younger than him, you know, comparatively speaking. So he was going to stick around for a while. And stick around he did, right? Next week he comes out, completely different character, right? completely different character, amazing, right? The JBL character, once again, like a lot of these other gimmicks, the reason why the JBL gimmick and character work well is because it is the polar opposite of Bradshaw, right? Like, if you really think about it, someone like Bradshaw, let's imagine JBL and Bradshaw being two different people. Bradshaw would hate JBL and vice versa. That's how you know this is an incredible gimmick shift, right? Like, Bradshaw would think that JBL is a boring loser and he should loosen up a little bit, drink some beers, you know what I mean? And JBL would think exactly what he said he thinks of Bradshaw in his first promo, that Bradshaw is an unfocused idiot who's too concerned with having fun instead of winning titles, right? This is almost the greatest gimmick shift of all time. But there is one more. There is one more. And I think the difference hinges on how well the gimmick was played. JBL's performance of JBL is a 10 out of 10. No doubt about it, right? Everything was different. Everything was different in almost like a grandiose way. Like, he'd come out with like a limousine with horns on it. You know what I mean? I don't even know how they found that car. Like, it's like what, every city they went to, they would just rent another car that had that. Like, how do you find that shit? Or did they just have one and they just transport it with them? Anyways, it doesn't matter. The point is, that gimmick was played very well, but not as well as this other one. And the other one is none other than Chris Jericho, coming in at number 1. Now, I'm tempted to say that Chris Jericho, all of his gimmicks, merit some sort of spot on this list, but let's be real, the Painmaker is not a real gimmick, right? The list is not a real gimmick. I'm talking about the main shift. The shift from the Ayatollah of rock and rolla to, like, the serious man, right, gimmick, right? The serious Jericho gimmick, like the stoic, like, you know, critical Jericho. Call it what you want, right? This is one of the greatest gimmick changes of all time, and in my opinion, it revitalized Chris Jericho's career. If Jericho had retired before coming back with this gimmick, I believe that Jericho would still have a Hall of Fame career, right? He would be, let's be honest, he would be a low-level Hall of Famer, and he would be a Hall of Famer because he was the first ever undisputed heavyweight champion. Because beyond that, he didn't really do much. He had good matches, but the vast majority of Jericho's great work comes in his second run with WWE, in my opinion, right? And this is, by far, by itself, a Hall of Fame worthy career. Then you could argue that Jericho has had 2, maybe even 3 Hall of Fame worthy careers since his return, right? Because he's done so many things, especially in AEW. Like, he definitely, like, if AEW ever has a Hall of Fame, he's like the first guy to go in should be Jericho. But anyways, let's talk about this gimmick for a little bit. Jericho went from this almost directionless, like, character who's just over the top, right? He's an over the top ass, right? Who can be both a face and a heel. Largely a face, sometimes a heel. Then he comes back as the serious Jericho, right? He revamps everything. First, when he comes back as like regular old Jericho, right? So that's whatever. But Jericho, as many people have noted in the past, is really good at reinventing himself. Specifically, I will say, Jericho is good at doing the things that are required to make the reinvention work, right? For example, Jericho came back, when he came back, with a new finishing move, the Codebreaker, which has since been copied by dozens of wrestlers, right? Jericho, then, when he turned heel, after he called Shawn Michaels a hypocrite and smashed his head into the Jeritron like 8,000 or whatever, this began a new Jericho. He started wearing, like, you know, like the underwear-looking tights instead of the long tights. He started being less flashy. He would still do, like, the lion salt and things like that, but he was much less flashy, right? Bobby Flashley up in this bitch. So, with all that being said, what made the character so good? Well, first of all, the crowd reactions. Second of all, he was just awesome at it, right? He played it really well. You almost felt the sense of hatred from Jericho, right? It's almost like the gimmick was too real to like ignore. Then the booking of this character, in my opinion, was excellent, right? Jericho is still Jericho. He's still a smaller guy, right? So it's never going to be believable for Jericho to like beat someone like Batista or, you know, even Triple H, right? Doesn't have the physical tools to believably do that. However, Jericho had excellent title runs. And in my opinion, he was part of like very, very cool segments. Number one, like the championship scramble match, right? Earlier in the night, he gets his ass beat by Shawn Michaels and breaks his tooth. Complete luck, but he loses the ladder match, whatever it was, to Shawn Michaels. And then he's inserted in the main event, and he wins it. Broken tooth and all. And he smiles, and you see his broken tooth. It just looks cool as shit. And then after this, like, he's banned from, like, Raw or whatever. He and Big Show win the tag team titles, which brings him back to Raw. You know, there's so many little elements that were very, very well booked. Obviously, the highest of the highlights were two things. Number one, his feud with Shawn Michaels, as well as his, you know, relatively forgotten and very underrated feud with Edge, where Jericho defeated Edge, the winner of the Royal Rumble, at WrestleMania, I believe, clean. You know, Jericho is that dude. Jericho, in my opinion, is one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. He might be the GOAT, if you ask me. But the large reason why he is not just because his gimmick was great, but because he's so able to play both gimmicks believably. In fact, the second gimmick, he played so believably that, like, when he returned to being like the Ayatollah of rock and roll with the light up jacket and everything, it just didn't feel right? It was like, oh, like, when is he going back to, like, the cool gimmick, right? Almost like The Undertaker when he switched back to, like, American Badass. Like, people were like, oh, when is this going to come back again, you know? And it finally did, and here we are. So, those have been the 10 greatest gimmick changes of all time. I think this list is perfect. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything. It's very possible because Hater's still stuck in traffic. I'm still somehow 25 minutes away from, like, where I'm going, you know what I mean? I left this motherfucker, like, almost 2 hours ago, and I've been stuck in. I could have gone, like, to, like, a different state, but anyways, it is what it is, cucks. That being said, take care of yourselves and go fuck your mothers.